every once in a while in Formula One, usually in that valley between the villages of Malmedy, Stavelot and the town of Spa-Francorchamps, the circuit we call Spa, there comes a qualifying session or a race in the semi-wet, in the drizzle, in the fog, with wet curbs, maybe a little bit drying on line, fast corners, really quick corners, very fast in a straight line, undulating, all the challenges that we don't normally see at other circuits. And I guess that's why we love Spa. That's why we love Spa on the Grand Prix calendar. And today was a classic example, I think, of a Spa qualifying session, wet throughout. They used intermediate tyres throughout all three Qs, Q1, Q2, Q3. And it was fascinating to watch. It was fascinating to compare the world's top drivers in these incredibly difficult conditions, very high speed, and how they reacted and how they managed the day. First of all, then, let's have a look at the qualifying results. As I say, they're all on intermediates. Max Verstappen was supremely quick in all three sessions. He's the only driver not to run a second set of intermediates and a second new set of intermediates in Q1. He was that confident, that good. And so therefore he wasn't quickest in Q1, but he was quickest in Q2, quickest in Q3, just nailed it every time. Always last out on the track, just to make sure that there's a bit of track cleaning going on in front. This started with Keke Rosberg years ago. I think it was 78 when he won the Daily Express Trophy in the pouring rain in a car called a Theodore. Yeah, good car, great car. And I saw him to Keke afterwards. I said, Keke, you're unbelievably quick in the wet. Tell me, how did you do it? And he said, I was just following the tracks left by the cars in front. And if you follow those, there's immediately more grip. That's what Max was doing today. So Max it was who was quickest in Q3, 53.1. He did a 53.2 right at the end on his second set of intermediates. The rain was a bit harder then, and that's when Charles Leclerc did his 53.7. Really, really good job by Charles Leclerc. This was Charles, the racing driver, coming out and doing what we know he can do. What he hasn't been doing very well in the last month or so since Monaco, but we know he can do it, and he was doing it on fast corners and slow. And I think actually the first four times are representative of drivers who did a very good job on all types of corner. And it's a real pleasure to include Sergio Perez in that. What a job he did today for Red Bull. He got it together in FP3, and the confidence remained throughout qualifying. He was always there. Not quite there with Max, but then you wouldn't expect him to be. But he was absolutely superb, and we'll compare him with Max a little bit later on into the video. But he did exactly the job he needed to do today, with Max having got a 10-place grid penalty. Have Sergio Perez up there with Max Verstappen starting now P11. And look at that grid now. Charles Leclerc on the pole, alongside him on the front row, Sergio Perez, exactly where you'd want to have your other driver in that situation. And then Lewis Hamilton, qualified fourth, will start third, obviously, in the Mercedes. Another superb lap by Lewis Hamilton. And in these conditions, I think that was a direct comparison with the way he drives compared with George Russell. George, as I say, is always a little bit more spiky, and we saw that in everything that happened, whether it was braking, whether it was the way he was getting the power on, and what Lewis is doing as well, going into Pouhon corner. We'll get onto that in a minute in the video. And then the two McLaren-Mercedes drivers. In the dry yesterday, they were really, really quick, and I think they will be tomorrow. They were never brilliant in Sector 2, which suggests that there's a downforce thing going on there. They didn't have quite the grip and confidence that they would have liked. That's what we saw today in the wet. But nonetheless, I think there was an interesting comparison also between those two drivers, the two McLaren drivers, and Max, Charles, Sergio Perez and Lewis Hamilton. And then George Russell, who didn't look as good as Lewis today in the wet, just very spiky, as I say. And Carlos Sainz didn't get in a great lap at the end, but I thought did a very good job. He lost time in Sector 2 through Turn 8, the very annoying, long, downhill, understeery right-hander, where Carlos Sainz is never, ever going to enjoy driving a racing car. And then into that downhill left-hander that follows. He wasn't brilliant through there either. And that was it for Carlos Sainz, compared with Charles Leclerc. And a bit of a shout-out there, too, for Fernando Alonso, did a good job in these difficult conditions. And Esteban Ocon, who was slower than Pierre Gasly throughout yesterday and most of today, but he was the guy that got into Q3 and not Pierre, much to Pierre's anguish. He had driven well, actually, all weekend, Pierre Gasly. The Alpine's not looking too bad at all. And Alex Albon did a good job too in the Williams. But let's get down to it now, because for me, the most dramatic corner at Spa, without a doubt, is Pouhon, the downhill, very, very fast left-hander, turn 10 if you want to be boring about it, but Pouhon by every other name. Great corner. And the analysis shows that Max Verstappen had a distinct advantage there. I'm not saying that was the reason he did that incredibly quick lap, but this is a snapshot of what he was doing on the approach to Pouhon and in the middle of Pouhon. And of course, you can then extrapolate that throughout the lap. So you can see there, Pouhon entry analysis, Pouhon corner analysis, entry speed followed by the minimum speed they're doing in the corner. That's not a truly accurate description of the way they took the corner, but that's the data we have. And when it's a really fast corner like that, actually looking at a minimum speed is not a stupid thing to do. So let's look at that. Max was approaching the fastest speed, that's the fastest approach speed before they touched the brakes or came out of the throttle going into Pouhon, 295. So we're talking 175 miles an hour, even in the wet. Very impressive, as I say, very fast corner. So Max is doing 295 kilometers an hour in 7th when he goes into Pouhon, and he does a perfect release of the accelerator and then application of the brakes. You just see the throttle going down and the brakes just grow. Absolutely perfect synchronization. And he gets down to 261. That's the slowest speed he had in the middle of Pouhon on his quickest lap. And he goes down 1 gear for 6th gear and then gets 7th on exit and holds 7th all the way down to Stablo, which they take in 4th. So that's your benchmark. That's what the guy who was quickest around Spa today was doing into Pouhon. Charles Leclerc, 1 kilometre slower going into Pouhon, probably because the Ferrari's not quite as good through that downhill left hand of the turn 9 as the Red Bull. Ferrari's good there. As we said, the Ferrari was never going to be slow on the slowish corners at Spa. But the problem for Ferrari was always going to be the faster corners, and it may well indeed still be the issue tomorrow in the dry, if it is dry. But in the wet, it kind of nullifies things. And there's Charles Leclerc going into Pouhon 294 in 7th. Takes 6, but he has to take a lot more speed out of the car, and his slowest mid-corner speed is 255 compared with Max Verstappen 261, and that's quite a lot. That's quite significant. Bearing in mind Charles Leclerc was really quick today, P2. I think the entry to Pouhon explains a lot about that difference. Part of that, I think, is Ferrari. I think a lot of it is Ferrari, but I think some of it also is Max Verstappen and his ability to keep the car absolutely flat to the road at all times, even in the wet. He's got the tyres absolutely square to the road. There's no lean on it when he wants to do something to it. Just beautiful to watch through there. I've kind of put them in order. They're not really in order when you get towards the end, but if you look at in terms of exit speed, Oscar Piastri very, very quick through Pouhon as well, 255. And again, like Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen, really, really good use of the throttle and the brakes, just perfect synchronization, no overlap at all. And I think that there's nothing wrong with overlap, but if you're going to brake because you want to slow the car down, you don't want throttle. And equally, if you want throttle, you don't want brake. Having said that, there is an argument for left foot braking to balance the car. We'll get onto that in a second. But Oscar Piastri definitely in the Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc throttle brake synchronization realm there. 292 though, slightly slower going into the corner. And I think he did have a moment coming out of turn 9. He goes up on the curb and that lost him a little bit, just a little bit of instability on the car in terms of acceleration, load going through the car, unnecessary load. So going in slightly slower and he's got a 255 mid-corner, slowest possible speed in the middle of Pouhon compared with, as I say, Max 261. So good job by Oscar Piastri in a car whose strongest point is going to be sectors 1 and 3. Lewis Hamilton, I think, a class act today going into Pouhon. If you're going to do overlap, do it as the way Lewis Hamilton does. He kept it in 7th gear, brushed the brake pedal, still with some throttle, about half throttle, and then through Pouhon. Down to 252. But look where George Russell is, 248. And you've got to assume that the Mercedes is not the easiest of cars to drive on fast corners, particularly in the semi-wet on intermediates. George Russell is all reflexes. Not all reflexes. He's just a reflexy driver. He's a spiky driver. He gets on top of a car. Very, very fast. Unbelievably fast. But here's Lewis Hamilton in the autumn of his career, can we say? 252 mid-corner speed. George Russell 248 and going down to 6th gear. And I think you could say, well, Max Verstappen's going down to 6, so is Charles Leclerc. But I think Lewis, because of the way the car is, because the Mercedes is a little bit edgy, because it's a bit knife edgy, I think Lewis found the way to drive it into Pouhon, which was just to keep everything as soft as possible. Don't worry about the gear change, just brush the brakes and get into the corner. And that's what we saw today. A beautiful bit of driving by Lewis Hamilton. I think that's why it added up to that P4, which of course will be P3 on the grid. Compare Lando Norris with Oscar Piastri now. 292, identical entry speed to Oscar Piastri. I said there Oscar lost a little bit time coming out of turn 9. Maybe he didn't. Maybe that was what the McLaren does on that run in 7th gear. But look how much speed Lando takes out of the car mid-corner. And this is on Lando's quickest lap compared with 2.55 of Oscar Piastri. And Max Verstappen 2.61. So there's a big difference there. Afterwards, Lando said something like, I'm not unhappy with that. I think we're struggling a bit today. I think we did okay. And I think he just sort of, in his mind, he just thought, in the wet, we're not going to be brilliant in sector 2, roll on tomorrow when it's not wet, we'll be fine, I can win the race tomorrow, sort of thing. He wasn't saying I can win the race tomorrow, but we'll be competitive tomorrow. But it's an astonishing difference there, isn't it, between Lando Norris just waiting till he's got the grip level he wants and he's confident with the car, and Oscar Piastri 2.55. In fairness to Lando, we should remember, of course, that he did actually out-qualify Oscar, but it just shows how much space and time Oscar lost somewhere else in the lap, because at Pouhon, at least, he's way ahead of Lando. But Lando gets it back with just consistency and neatness and tidiness, where Oscar was making the odd mistake on acceleration in other parts of the lap. And then Sergio Perez, he looks fabulous. He looks really good in the car. He's playing exactly the role that Red Bull want him to play. And of course, he could quite easily win the race tomorrow, starting alongside Charles Leclerc. The Red Bull, in theory, should be a better car than the Ferrari. Yes, there'll be the McLarens coming up. Yes, there'll be Max, in theory, coming up as well. But Sergio Perez could be in a position to get a great result tomorrow and then silence all the critics. Oh yeah, keep Perez. What a wonderful second driver to Max Verstappen. Anyway, look at him, 2.95 in 7th. That's exactly what Max is doing. And he keeps it in 7th as well. Now, I think in this case, you could say probably the Max system. Well, you got to say the Max system is definitely quicker. But from where Sergio Perez is coming from, and where he is right now in his career, he doesn't want to make any more mistakes. He doesn't want to drop the car. He doesn't want to go down to 6 and have all those revs and all that talk. He just wants to keep things gentle and smooth, and that's exactly what he did. Beautiful, beautiful synchronization between the brake and throttle as well. Absolutely fabulous to watch, to see on the graphics. 2.95, 2.51 mid-corner, slowest minimum speed. Yeah, 10 kilometers slower than Max Verstappen in the same car. That's about what you'd expect in a corner like Pouhon in the wet. Max is that good. And that more than anything, it just shows how good Max Verstappen is. If anybody has any doubts, that's how good he is. Because Perez was not slow today, and he was driving well. And yet, in that corner of corners, 10 kilometers an hour difference. And then there's Carlos Sainz in the Ferrari. Didn't get in a great lap, but in terms of Pouhon, not too bad at all. 2.92, a little bit slower than Charles Leclerc going into the corner. Maybe that's, I think, as I said earlier, I think that's Carlos was the 2 worst corners for a driver like Carlos Sainz, who just loves to get in a little bit late, a little bit wide and get the power on. He's really good at that. Those 2 corners preceding Pouhon, those downhill right-handers are just born with for understeer, just not Carlos Sainz corners. But Pouhon is. He comes in at 2.92, which isn't massively quick, 2 kilometres down. But 2.57 mid-corner, slower speed in the middle of Pouhon, that's pretty impressive. So Carlos Sainz, you can see that's the sort of driver he is. He's very, very good at keeping the minimum speed as high as possible. Whereas Max Verstappen, normally on a medium speed corner, slow speed corners, not interested in mid-corner speed and minimum speed. He's interested in extending the straight in and out of the corner. That's not the case on a corner like Pouhon. It's not that sort of corner, particularly in the wet. It's just a corner you need to get round with the minimum possible fuss and with losing the least amount of speed. And Carlos Sainz lost that speed on the 2 slow corners, not at Pouhon. He was fabulous through Pouhon. That's what that stat shows us, I think. So, yeah, for me, it was an enthralling day. Wonderful to see Grand Prix cars on that circuit. I mean, watching George wasn't as good as Lewis today, but he was spectacular as anything. Every time we saw George, he was doing one of these and power on. Wow, fabulous to watch. Every time we saw Max, he was in a straight line. He had one sort of slight thing coming out of Stabilo, didn't really slow him. McLaren will be quick tomorrow. In theory, as we saw yesterday, they'll be as quick as the Red Bull. So Max will be just thinking right now, just see how it goes. Let's get through the first corner and then just do the perfect race if we can and see where it ends up. Anything could happen, as we saw today with McLaren not being super quick when it really came down to the crunch in Q3. So yeah, great qualifying session, and it tees up well for a race. A bit of an artificial thing, this ridiculous thing of a 10-place grid penalty for the driver. for something that is absolutely nothing to do with him whatsoever. The team, of course, takes the hit as well. But I've said this before, I think that with this whole engine thing, nothing wrong with having a penalty. But they need to come up with a penalty system that doesn't penalise the driver. It should penalise the team, but not the driver, in my opinion. And I think, it's kind of sad that somebody who drives as well as Max Verstappen drove today to get the pole on a circuit like Spa in the wet has got to start P11. I'm going to talk about deflating. Anyway, they knew what was happening coming in, and as we said right from the start of the weekend, if you're going to choose a race where you've got to take a 10-place grid penalty, you choose Spa because it's relatively easy to overtake once you're through the first corner accident, that is. So that's it. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Again, thank you to Jetcraft, thank you to OEM Exclusive, and thank you to Track Ninja. I'm going to close with a few photographs from 60 years ago, the 1964 Belgian Grand Prix, an anniversary thereof. An amazing finish, probably the most amazing finish to any Grand Prix in the history of the sport, you got to say, because for most of the afternoon, the race belonged to Dan Gurney in the Brabham Climax. He was on the pole and he just disappeared into the distance. But guess what? Dan ran out of fuel on the penultimate lap and came to rest at Stavelot. The car was just out of fuel on his last lap, and he got out of the car and he's sitting on the back of the car. Graham Hill then inherited the lead, and he stopped just before the checkered flag with a fuel pump failure. Bruce McLaren then inherited the lead. He'd been running third, and he ran out of fuel and didn't make the checkered flag either. And Jim Clark had had one of his worst days in a long time because his engine was way down on power. Came across the line. The guy with the checkered flag didn't know what was going on. Jimmy went under the checkered flag, and then he ran out of fuel at Stavelot, parked his Lotus 33 alongside Dan Gurney's Brabham. Dan said, "Hey, Jimmy, how you doing? I've just heard on the PA you won the race." Jimmy couldn't believe it. They sat there having a laugh. That was how Jim Clark won his third of his 4 Belgian Grand Prix. Anyway, there we are. Big thanks to Peter Nygaard and Grand Prix Photo for this little montage. See you tomorrow.